He sat down one day and decided to make cheese. There was no moment of genius, no scientist in a lab, no king who ordered it done. The food that would go on to feed Roman legions, pay taxes for medieval kings, and show up on every dinner table in the Western world, nobody actually meant to create it. It just sort of happened, in a desert, about 8,000 years ago. And the whole thing started because one man just wanted a drink of milk. Here's what went down. A nomad somewhere in the Middle East was crossing the desert on horseback. He'd packed his milk in the only container he had, a pouch made from a sheep's stomach. He tied it to his horse, climbed up and rode off into the heat. Several hours later, he stopped to drink. He reached into the pouch expecting milk, and what he pulled out instead were two things: a thin, watery liquid and a bunch of soft white lumps. He didn't know it at the time, but the lining of that sheep's stomach contained a natural enzyme. The desert heat cooked things along, the rocking motion of the horse kept things moving, and together, those three things did what no person had ever done on purpose. They turned milk into something else entirely. He drank the liquid, he tasted the lumps, and by all accounts, he didn't hate it. That's how cheese got started. An accident, a pouch made from a dead sheep, and a man who was too hungry to say no. Now, you might wonder why that discovery mattered so much. A guy eating lumpy milk in the desert. Big deal, right? Well, here's the thing about milk back then. It went bad fast. Before refrigerators, before ice boxes, before any way to keep things cold, milk spoiled in a day or two, especially in summer, especially in hot climates. For farming communities in the ancient Middle East, that was a real problem. You had cows and goats producing milk every day, more than you could drink, and most of it rotting before anyone could use it. But cheese, hard cheese, could last for months. In some cases, years. It was the ancient world's version of canned food, and once people figured that out, word spread fast. You didn't make cheese because it tasted good. You made cheese because it kept you alive through a long winter, when there was nothing else to eat. That simple idea, milk you can keep, turned cheese from an accident into one of the most important foods in human history. And once something becomes that important, powerful people start paying attention. By the time the Roman Empire was at its height, cheese wasn't just food anymore. It was currency, it was supply chain, it was strategy. Roman soldiers marching across Europe carried hard cheese in their packs, because it didn't spoil, it was dense with calories, and it didn't slow them down. Wherever Roman legions went, cheesemaking followed. They taught the technique to the tribes they conquered across Britain, France, and the Alps. A lot of the classic European cheeses we know today trace their lineage straight back to Rome. And Julius Caesar himself? He had a soft spot for the moldy stuff. The kind most people today would sniff, make a face at, and put back in the deli case. Caesar apparently loved it. But Caesar wasn't the most obsessed, powerful man in cheese history. That title, honestly, might belong to the Mongols. When Genghis Khan's armies swept across Central Asia and into Europe in the 1200s, they didn't fight like other armies. Other armies needed supply lines, grain shipments, and regular stops to resupply. The Mongols could ride for weeks and not stop, because they carried dried meat and hard cheese on their horses. That portability gave them a military edge that historians still talk about. They could besiege a city for months while their enemies ran out of food, because the Mongols had cheese in their saddlebags and weren't going anywhere. A food that started as a happy accident in the desert ended up helping build the largest land empire in history. Not a bad run for lumpy milk. But for all the emperors and generals who relied on cheese, nobody in this story loved it quite as publicly and as embarrassingly as Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon conquered most of Europe. He rewrote legal codes, redesigned governments, and won battles that military historians still study today. The man was not known for weakness, and yet he had one. A deeply, almost comically stinky French cheese called époisse. Époisse is a soft cheese from Burgundy, washed in brandy as it ages, and its smell is powerful enough that there are persistent stories about it being banned on French public transportation. Whether that's actually true is up for debate, but the fact that people believe it gives you a sense of what you're dealing with. Napoleon loved it. His favorite. The cheese that grown adults will hold at arm's length eventually became a regular at the imperial table, because the man who ran France wanted it there. And speaking of France and cheese, Charles de Gaulle, another man who ran the country about 150 years after Napoleon, once threw up his hands and said, "How can anyone govern a country that has 246 varieties of cheese?" He was exasperated. But he also kind of had a point. France is the most obvious place to talk about when it comes to cheese culture, but some of the most interesting cheese history in Europe happened not in palaces or markets, but in the quiet back rooms of monasteries. During the Middle Ages, after Rome fell and Europe fragmented into smaller kingdoms and constant warfare, it was the monks who kept cheesemaking alive. Monasteries had something that the rest of the world lacked: stability. They had cool stone cellars for aging. They had enough land to keep livestock. They had time, routine, and a real commitment to not wasting food. And so while the outside world was busy fighting, the monks were in their cellars, experimenting. A lot of what they produced came about the same way the original cheese had, by accident. At some point in medieval France, someone left a wheel of cheese too long in a damp limestone cave. Mold started growing on it, the kind of blue-green mold that looks like something you'd throw out. A monk, probably out of pure stubbornness about waste, tasted it anyway. That was Roquefort. One of the most celebrated cheeses in the world today got its start because a monk didn't want to admit he'd messed up. Gruyere, Brie, Emmental, and dozens of others followed the same general path. Patient monks, cool caves, a certain amount of things going wrong in interesting ways, and the willingness to taste the results. By the 1500s, Europe had over 50 distinct types of cheese, almost all of them born in monastery cellars. Now, if cheese could become currency, and if powerful men could embarrass themselves over a smelly wheel of it, it probably won't surprise you to learn that at least one man treated a block of cheese the way most people treat their life savings. In 1666, the Great Fire of London tore through the city. Buildings burned for days. Tens of thousands of people lost everything. One of those people was a man named Samuel Pepys, who kept one of the most detailed diaries in English history. Pepys watched the fire coming and made a decision. He ran to his yard, grabbed a shovel, and buried his wheel of Parmesan cheese in the ground. Not the silver, not the documents, the Parmesan. He figured the cheese was valuable enough to protect the same way you'd protect gold, and he was probably right. A good wheel of aged Parmesan in 1666 was worth serious money, which, oddly enough, is still true today. In Italy right now, wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano are used as collateral for bank loans. Cheese dairies take their wheels to financial institutions, and those institutions lend against the value of the aging cheese in their vaults. There are actual bank vaults in Emilia-Romagna that contain nothing but slowly aging Parmesan wheels, each one worth several thousand euros. Samuel Pepys, it turns out, was ahead of his time. Of course, if you're going to talk about cheese history being strange, you can't leave out Casu Marzu. Casu Marzu comes from Sardinia, the Italian island off the western coast. It's a sheep's milk cheese, traditional and ancient, and what makes it different from every other cheese in the world is that it's made with live insect larvae inside it. The process works like this. A wheel of Sardinian cheese is left out, and flies are allowed to lay their eggs in it. The larvae hatch and eat their way through the cheese from the inside, breaking down the fats and creating a texture that locals describe as creamy and intensely flavorful. The cheese is considered ready when it's still moving. The European Union banned it on food safety grounds, and you can understand why. But in Sardinia, people have been eating it for centuries, and they consider it part of their cultural heritage. There's an ongoing effort to have it officially recognized as a traditional food so it can be sold legally again. One more thing worth knowing if you're ever offered a slice. You're supposed to eat it with your eyes closed, because the larvae can jump several inches when disturbed. That's either the most off-putting thing you've ever heard about food, or it's a reminder that delicious is a moving target that varies a lot by culture and by century. But here's something that cuts across every culture and every century. People have always gone back for more cheese. There's actually a reason for that, and it's got nothing to do with willpower. Cheese contains a protein called casein. When your body digests casein, it produces compounds called casomorphins, which interact with the same receptors in your brain that respond to feel-good signals. Not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, just a quiet, steady sense of satisfaction. People have been eating cheese for 8,000 years without knowing any of this. They just knew that eating it felt good, and so they kept doing it. And as it turns out, their bodies were onto something real. Cheese is dense with calcium, which keeps your bones strong, and that matters more with every passing decade. After 40, bone density starts to drop, and getting enough calcium through food, rather than pills, is one of the best ways to slow that down. Aged cheese also contains beneficial bacteria that support gut health, similar to yogurt, just in a form that's been around a whole lot longer. For most of human history, cheese wasn't a treat. It was one of the most reliable sources of nutrition available, especially in winter, especially in cold climates, and especially for people who couldn't count on much else. A writer named Clifton Fadiman once described cheese as milk's leap toward immortality. He meant it as a compliment to the flavor, but thinking about it now, it seems like a fair description of the whole story. Milk spoils. Cheese, made right, can last for years. It survived the fall of Rome, traveled in the saddlebags of Mongol warriors, got buried in a London garden during a fire, got banned on public transit in France, and somehow still ended up on your grocery shelf next to the crackers. An unknown nomad in the Middle East, 8,000 years ago, opened a pouch made from a sheep's stomach and found something he didn't expect. He ate it anyway, and the world kept going from there. Tonight, when you pull a block of cheddar out of the fridge or put together a cheese plate before dinner, you're at the end of a very long line. Every person who ever made cheese carried it to war, aged it in a monastery cellar, or buried it in their backyard to keep it safe. They all passed something down. It ended up in your kitchen,